Sometimes the smallest kindness can unlock the biggest truth. When Cally Dray bought a loaf of bread for a lonely old woman in a mountain bakery, she thought it was just another cold afternoon helping a stranger. The woman's name was Nessa Allred. And then her son walked in. Gabe Allred hadn't been seen in over 20 years. The town thought he was dead, but there he stood, carrying secrets from a war nobody wanted to remember. What happened next changed everything, not just for a mother and her lost son, but for Cally too. Because sometimes the past doesn't stay buried. What could one loaf of bread possibly uncover? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The wind came down from the high peaks like a living thing that morning, sharp enough to draw blood if you turned your face wrong into it. Cally Dray had learned long ago not to fight the mountain cold. You worked with it, moved through it, respected it the way you'd respect any force larger than yourself. She'd been up since before dawn, checking her trap lines in the timber country above Pine Haven, her breath hanging white in the air as she moved between the lodgepole pines, with the practiced silence of someone who'd spent more years among trees than people. She was 53 years old, though the mountains had a way of marking time differently on a person. Her face carried the weather of every season she'd endured, fine lines around her eyes from squinting into snow glare, deeper creases at the corners of her mouth from years of keeping her thoughts to herself. Her hands were strong, scarred across the knuckles from decades of handling steel traps and skinning knives. She wore her father's old canvas coat, the one he'd worn when he'd taught her these same trap lines 40 years back, before the cancer took him. The coat still smelled faintly of pine pitch and wood smoke, scents that had become part of her own skin over the years. Pine Haven sat at the end of a Forest Service road that didn't go anywhere else. Population 200 when everyone was home, which they rarely were all at once. It was the kind of place where people came to disappear or to find something they'd lost in the noise of the world below. Cally had been born here, in a cabin 3 miles up the mountain from where the town proper began. Her mother had died when she was 12, leaving just her and her father and her younger brother Owen to make sense of the silence that followed. Her father had taught them both the old ways, how to read animal sign, how to set traps without leaving human scent, how to field dress a deer and cure the hide. Owen had taken to it naturally, his hands quick and sure even as a boy. But Owen was gone now. Had been gone for 34 years, since that autumn morning when his rifle had gone off while he was crossing Willow Creek. That's what they'd called it. An accident. A terrible accident. Cally had been 18 then, just starting to imagine a life that might take her beyond these mountains. Owen's death had frozen that imagining solid as January ice. She'd stayed, built her life around the trap lines and the seasons, around the solitary work that asked nothing of her heart. She had a cabin now, the one her father had left her, modernized just enough to have running water and electricity, but still heated by the same wood stove that had warmed her childhood. She lived alone and preferred it that way. People in town knew her as reliable, fair in her dealings, not unkind but not warm either. She traded her pelts twice a year, bought her supplies, and went back up the mountain to the quiet that had become her only real companion. By mid-morning, she'd checked the last of her lines and was heading into town with 3 marten pelts and a red fox in her pack. The cold had intensified, the kind of deep January freeze that made your teeth ache and turned your breath to ice crystals in your beard if you had one. She didn't, but she'd wrapped a wool scarf across her face anyway, only her eyes showing above it as she drove her old truck down the rutted forest road toward Pine Haven. The town looked like a faded photograph of itself in winter. Main Street ran for 3 blocks, lined with false front buildings that had seen better decades. There was Kowalski's General Store, the post office that doubled as the library twice a week, the Timberline Bar where the loggers drank when there was work, and Tremaine's Bakery, which somehow stayed in business despite the fact that nobody could figure out how Holt Tremaine made any money selling bread and coffee to a population that small. Cally parked in front of the bakery. Her original plan had been to stop at the general store first, but the smell of fresh bread caught her as soon as she stepped out of the truck, and she realized she hadn't eaten anything since a piece of cold venison at dawn. The warmth hit her like a wall when she pushed through the bakery door, and she had to stop a moment to let her eyes adjust to the light, and her skin adjust to the temperature change that made her face tingle and burn. Holt Tremaine stood behind the counter, a man in his 70s with a flour-dusted apron and hands that never quite stopped shaking anymore. He'd been a baker since before Cally was born, learned the trade in Seattle before coming up here to escape some sadness nobody talked about. His wife had passed a decade back, but he kept the bakery running, kept his hands busy, kept the ovens warm. "Cally," he said, nodding. He didn't waste words, which was one of the reasons she liked him. "Holt." She unwrapped the scarf from her face. "Coffee and whatever's warm. Got cinnamon rolls just out." "Coffee's fresh." She nodded and turned to find a seat, and that's when she saw the old woman sitting by the window. The woman was small, thin in the way of people who'd weathered a long grief. She wore a wool coat that had been good quality once, but was worn thin now at the elbows and collar. Her hands rested on the table in front of her, empty except for a pair of knitted gloves she'd taken off. She was looking out the window at the snow beginning to fall again, her face composed but distant, like she was watching something the rest of them couldn't see. Cally recognized her. Nessa Allred. She'd been a widow for going on 10 years now, her husband Earl having worked as a deputy sheriff back in the day before dying of a heart attack out in his garden. Nessa lived alone at the edge of town, in a house that was too big for one person, surviving on whatever pension Earl had left her. She came into town once a week for groceries, spoke to people politely but briefly, and went back to her solitude. They'd never been friends. Cally and Nessa, they'd never been anything, really, except two women who understood that sometimes solitude was the only honest response to loss. But something about the way Nessa sat there, about the particular quality of her aloneness in that moment, touched something in Cally that she'd thought she'd buried deep enough it wouldn't trouble her anymore. It was the memory of her own mother in those last months, sitting by windows, her hands empty, waiting for something that wasn't coming. Holt brought her coffee and a cinnamon roll, still warm enough to steam. "That's $4.50. Cally pulled out her wallet, then hesitated. "What's the old woman drinking?" Holt glanced over. "Just water. She comes in sometimes to get warm. Never buys anything." Cally looked at the bills in her hand. She'd made decent money on the pelts this season, but it was never money you wasted. Winter was long, and expenses were real, and you never knew when the trapping would go lean. But her father's voice was in her head suddenly. Something he'd said after her mother died. "We do right by our own. And everybody up here is our own when it comes down to it." "Give her one of those loaves," Cally said, pointing to the crusty bread on the shelf behind the counter. "The wheat one." Holt's eyebrows went up slightly, but he didn't ask questions. He wrapped a loaf in paper and carried it over to Nessa's table. Cally watched the old woman's face change. Surprise first, then something that might have been the beginning of tears, then a kind of fierce dignity that pulled it all back in. Nessa looked across the bakery to where Cally sat, and their eyes met. Cally nodded once, a small acknowledgement, nothing more. She didn't want thanks. She didn't want conversation. She just wanted to have done one small, decent thing in a world that didn't offer many opportunities for that kind of grace. Nessa nodded back, her hands closing around the wrapped bread like it was something precious. Cally turned back to her coffee, feeling strange about the whole exchange. It had been a long time since she'd let herself feel anything much beyond the basic satisfactions of work done well and solitude maintained. This flicker of connection, small as it was, felt dangerous somehow, like the first crack in a frozen river that meant you needed to step careful, or risk going through the ice into something you couldn't control. She drank her coffee and ate her roll and tried to settle herself back into the familiar walls of self-sufficiency. Outside, the snow was coming down heavier now, big flakes that caught the light and turned the world soft and white. It would be a good afternoon to be home, to have the fire going and work on stretching those pelts while the storm did whatever it was going to do. She was just finishing her coffee, just beginning to wrap the scarf back around her face in preparation for the cold, when the bakery door opened and a man walked in. He brought the storm with him, snow on his shoulders, cold air rolling off his clothes, ice in his dark hair. But it wasn't the weather that made everyone in the bakery stop and stare. It was the fact that the man standing there, brushing snow from his coat sleeves, was supposed to be dead. Cally felt the recognition like a physical blow, even though she hadn't seen his face in over 20 years. Even though he'd aged and weathered and carried scars he hadn't carried back then. She knew him. Gabe Allred, Nessa's son. The boy who'd gone off to war and never come home. The one they'd held a memorial service for without a body. The one whose name was on the veterans' monument outside the town hall with the dates of his too short life carved into granite. Except he was standing right there, very much alive, looking around the bakery with eyes that had seen things nobody should have to see. And when his gaze landed on his mother, sitting small and alone by the window with a loaf of bread in her hands, the look that crossed his face was something Cally didn't have words for. Grief and relief and fear all mixed together. The expression of a man who'd been carrying impossible weight for far too long. "Mom," he said, and his voice cracked on the word like he was 17 again, instead of whatever age he was now, 50-something. Probably, though it was hard to tell with the lines the years had carved into his face. Nessa Allred stood up slowly, the bread falling from her hands to the table. Her mouth opened, but nothing came out. She swayed slightly, and Cally found herself halfway out of her seat, some instinct to catch the old woman if she fell. But Nessa didn't fall. She stood there, solid as the mountains outside, and stared at her son who'd come back from the dead. "Gabriel," she finally whispered. "My boy." And then the bakery erupted into something Cally couldn't quite track. Holt dropping a tray behind the counter, the clatter of metal on tile, voices rising in shock and recognition. Someone running out the door to spread the impossible news through town. But Cally only watched as Gabe Allred crossed the small distance to his mother and stood before her, his hands hanging useless at his sides, like he didn't know if he had the right to touch her after all these years. "I'm sorry," he said. And there was a lifetime of sorrow in those two words. "I'm so sorry it took this long." The bakery had gone absolutely still, the kind of silence that follows miracles or disasters when you can't quite tell which you're witnessing. Gabe Allred stood before his mother, snow melting on his shoulders, and Cally could see now the military bearing in the way he held himself, the way his eyes swept the room before settling back on Nessa, alert, assessing. A man trained to see danger before it arrived. He was older than she'd expected, though that made sense if you did the math. He'd been 19 when he left, which would make him 52 or 53 now, around her own age. His face was lean, weathered in a way that spoke of years spent in harsh places. A scar ran from his left temple down past his ear, white against sun-darkened skin. His hair was more grey than dark now, cut military short. He wore civilian clothes, jeans, work boots, a heavy canvas jacket, but everything about him said soldier. Nessa's hands were shaking as she reached toward him, then pulled back, as if afraid he might disappear if she touched him. "They told me you were dead 23 years ago. They came to my door with a flag and condolences, and they told me you were gone." "I know." Gabe's voice was rough, like he'd forgotten how to use it for anything except orders or silence. "I'm sorry, Mom. I'm so sorry." "How?" The word came out broken. "How are you standing here?" Around them, the handful of other people in the bakery watched with open mouths. Holt had come out from behind the counter, his flour-dusted hands gripping a towel like it might anchor him to a world that suddenly made no sense. Someone had pulled out a phone, probably already spreading the news. And Cally felt a surge of protectiveness she didn't entirely understand. This moment was too raw, too private for the whole town to consume like gossip. "Can we talk somewhere?" Gabe asked his mother, his eyes flicking to the watching crowd. "Just you and me." But before Nessa could answer, Holt spoke up. his voice gentle but firm. "Take the back room. Nobody will bother you there." Gabe nodded his thanks. Then carefully, as if his mother might shatter, he took her elbow and guided her toward the door behind the counter that led to Holt's small office and storage area. As they passed, Gabe's gaze swept across Cally where she still stood, half risen from her seat, and something flickered in his eyes. Recognition? No, that didn't make sense. She'd been just a kid when he left, and he wouldn't have paid attention to some 15-year-old girl back then. The door closed behind them with a soft click that somehow felt final. "Did you see that?" someone whispered, and the bakery erupted into low, urgent conversation. But Cally barely heard it. She was trying to place that look Gabe had given her, trying to understand why her heart was beating so hard in her chest, why her hands felt cold despite the warmth of the bakery. She sat back down heavily, her coffee forgotten and cold now. Through the window, the snow fell steadily, already covering the tracks Gabe's boots had made on the sidewalk. Like the world was trying to erase the proof that he'd been here at all. 20 minutes passed, maybe longer. Holt quietly asked people to give the Allreds their privacy, and gradually the other customers left, casting curious glances at the closed door as they went. Soon, it was just Cally and Holt in the main room, the baker wiping down tables that didn't need wiping, both of them pretending they weren't listening to the low murmur of voices from the back room. Cally should have left. She had no business being here, no claim on this reunion between mother and son. But something kept her in her seat, some instinct she couldn't name, that said this moment mattered. That whatever was happening behind that door somehow involved her too. When the door finally opened, Nessa came out first. Her face was blotchy from crying, but also transformed somehow, lit from within by something that looked like hope and hurt mixed together. Gabe followed, his hand still gentle on her shoulder, steadying her. They stopped when they saw Cally still sitting there. Nessa's eyes went to the bread on her table, the loaf Cally had bought for her, and fresh tears spilled down her weathered cheeks. "Thank you," she said, her voice thick. "For the bread. For the kindness. You couldn't have known what it would mean, having my boy walk in right after?" Cally nodded, uncomfortable with the gratitude, with the emotion filling the small bakery. "Just bread," she managed. But Gabe was looking at her with that strange intensity again, and this time he spoke. "Cally Dray?" She felt the shock of her name in his mouth like cold water. "How do you know me?" "You're Owen's sister." The sound of her brother's name after all these years, spoken by this ghost from the past, hit her like a physical blow. She stood up too fast, her chair scraping loud against the floor. "What does my brother have to do with you?" Gabe's face softened with what looked like genuine sorrow. "Owen was my best friend. We hunted together that last summer before I deployed. He stopped, swallowed hard. "He was a good kid. I heard about what happened. The accident. I'm sorry I wasn't here for the funeral." Cally's mind was reeling, trying to match her memories of that last summer before Owen died with this man standing before her. She'd been so lost in her own grief after Owen's death that whole period had blurred together. But yes, Owen had been spending time with someone, an older boy. She remembered her father mentioning it. Something about Gabe Allred teaching Owen to track elk in the high country. "I remember you now," she said slowly. "Owen talked about you, said you were the best tracker he'd ever seen." "He was better," Gabe said quietly. "Learned faster than anyone I'd taught." He paused, and something shifted in his expression, something harder coming into his eyes. "I need to tell you something about Owen, about that day he died." The bakery seemed to tilt slightly, the walls pressing in. "It was an accident," Cally said, but her voice sounded hollow even to her own ears. "Everyone said it was an accident. Everyone was wrong." Gabe's words fell like stones into still water. "I've been living with this for 20 years. Cally, I found evidence at the scene before I deployed, things that didn't add up. But I was shipping out, and I thought I'd have time to investigate when I got back. But I didn't come back, not for a long time. And when I finally could, the trail was cold, and I had nothing but suspicions and questions that nobody wanted to answer." Nessa made a small sound of distress, her hand going to her mouth. Holt had stopped pretending to wipe tables and was staring openly now. Cally felt her whole body go rigid, every muscle locking up like a trap springing closed. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying your brother's death wasn't an accident." Gabe's voice was gentle but relentless. "I'm saying someone killed him and made it look like one. And I'm saying I came back to this town to prove it." The words hung in the warm air of the bakery, impossible and terrible, and somehow, in the deepest part of herself, something Cally had always suspected might be true. "That's quite an accusation to make after 23 years, Holt said quietly. And there was warning in his voice, but also something else. Curiosity, maybe, or recognition. "I have evidence," Gabe said. "Not enough to take to the authorities yet, but enough to start asking questions. Enough to know I'm right." He turned back to Cally. "I came back for 2 reasons. My mother is one." His eyes held hers, unwavering. "You're the other, because Owen was your brother, and you deserve to know the truth about how he died." Cally stood there, her father's coat suddenly too heavy on her shoulders, the warmth of the bakery suffocating. Outside, the snow kept falling, covering everything, hiding everything, the way it always had. The way lies had covered the truth about Owen for 34 years. "I don't believe you," she said, but the words came out weak, unconvincing even to herself. "I know," Gabe said, "but you will." Cally left the bakery without another word, pushing out into the cold and snow with Gabe's impossible claim echoing in her skull. Her truck wouldn't start at first. The cold had gotten to the battery, and she sat there cranking the ignition while her breath fogged the windshield and her hands shook on the steering wheel. When the engine finally caught, she drove too fast. Up the mountain road, the truck fishtailing on the fresh snow, not caring, just needing to be away from town, away from the past that Gabe Allred had dragged back into the light. But the past was already with her, riding in the passenger seat like a ghost she'd refused to acknowledge for 34 years. Owen, her baby brother, though he'd hated when she called him that. He'd been 2 years younger, all gangly limbs, and quick laughter and dreams bigger than these mountains could contain. He'd wanted to be a wildlife biologist, had already been accepted to the university in Missoula for that fall. He'd talked about studying wolf populations, about helping to bring back species that had been pushed to the edge of extinction. He'd seen the world as something that could be healed, that could be made better if people just cared enough to try. She'd loved him fiercely, protectively, the way you love someone who still believes the world is good, and then he died, and the world had proven him wrong. That morning, she could still see it clear as yesterday, her father coming back from town with his face grey and drawn, saying there'd been an accident, saying Owen had been crossing Willow Creek with his rifle, and somehow it had gone off, the bullet taking him in the chest. Him dying right there in the cold water before anyone could reach him. The sheriff had called it a tragic accident. Their father had identified the body. They'd buried Owen in the cemetery up on the hill, and Cally had stood there in her black dress, 18 years old, and feeling like something vital had been carved out of her chest and buried with her brother. She never questioned it, never thought to question it. Accidents happened in these mountains. People died. You grieved and you moved on because that's what you did to survive. But what if it hadn't been an accident? She pulled into her cabin drive, killed the engine, sat in the sudden silence. The snow was piling up on the windshield already, and she watched it accumulate, each flake joining the others, until the view was obscured completely. Inside, the cabin was cold. She built up the fire, put on coffee, tried to settle herself with familiar routines. But her hands wouldn't stop shaking, and eventually she gave up and just sat at her kitchen table, staring at the worn wood grain while the coffee maker burbled and the fire crackled and everything felt wrong in a way she couldn't fix. There was a photograph on the mantel, one of the few she kept out. It showed Owen at 16, holding up a rainbow trout he'd caught in the high lakes, his face split wide with pride and joy. She'd taken that picture. She could remember the exact moment. The August light, the sound of the wind in the pines. Owen's voice saying, "Make sure you get the fish in the shot, Cal. I want to remember him." She got up and took the photograph down, held it in both hands, studied her brother's face. Had he been afraid that summer? Had he known something was wrong? She tried to remember, but it was so long ago, and grief had a way of blurring the details that came before it. The knock on her door made her jump. She wasn't used to visitors. People in town knew to leave her alone. But when she opened the door, Gabe Allred stood on her porch, snow dusting his shoulders again, his eyes steady on hers. "I know you don't want to see me," he said, before she could speak. "But I need to show you something, evidence I've been collecting. If after you see it, you want me to leave you alone, I will. But you deserve to know the truth about Owen." She should have slammed the door, should have sent him away, back to whatever hole he'd crawled out of after 23 years. But the photograph was still in her hands, and Owen's smile was still bright in the fading light, and some part of her that had been sleeping for decades woke up and said, "Yes, I need to know." "Come in," she said, stepping back. He entered carefully, like a man walking into a potential ambush, his eyes taking in everything, the simple furniture, the wood stove throwing heat, the trap lines hanging on the wall, the rifle over the door. He moved with that military precision still, even in a civilian setting. "Coffee?" she asked, because she didn't know what else to say. "Thank you." She poured 2 cups, added sugar to hers the way she always did, left his black. They sat at this table, the photograph of Owen still lying there between them. "He was a good kid," Gabe said quietly, looking at the photo. "One of the best people I've ever known, and I've known a lot of people in this world." "You were friends?" Cally asked. "I remember now that he mentioned you, but I was so wrapped up in my own life that summer, getting ready to leave for college. I didn't pay enough attention. We'd go up into the back country tracking elk. He had a gift for it, could read sign better than men who'd been doing it for 40 years. And he asked questions, good questions, about the land, about the animals, about how everything connected." Gabe wrapped his hands around the coffee cup like he was trying to warm something deeper than his fingers. "That last week before I deployed, he told me he'd seen something that worried him." Cally's pulse kicked up. "What?" "Men loading crates into trucks up in the old mining country. Late at night. He'd been up there photographing owls for a school project. He had this old camera your dad had given him. He said one of the men was Dalton Greer." The name hit her like a slap. Dalton Greer. She remembered him. A kid, a couple. Years older than Gabe. Always in some kind of trouble, his family running a gas station and repair shop on the edge of town. His uncle had been the sheriff back then. What does that have to do with Owen's death? Owen told me he thought they were smuggling something, said he'd gotten photographs. He wanted to know what he should do, whether to go to the authorities or just forget it. Gabe's jaw tightened. "I told him to be careful, to maybe wait until I got back from deployment, that we'd figure it out together. I never thought—" He stopped, swallowed. 3 days after I left, he was dead. "Why didn't you say something?" "Then why wait all these years? Because the day after the funeral, I was ambushed overseas. My entire unit was hit. Only 3 of us survived, and we were offered a choice, new identities and continued service in deep cover operations, or come home and risk the people who'd targeted us, finding our families." His eyes were dark with old pain. "I chose to disappear, to protect my mother, to protect anyone else who might be at risk. But you're here now. Now the people who wanted me dead are either dead themselves or in prison. Now I'm free to come home." He pulled a manila folder from inside his jacket, laid it on the table. "And now I've had 20 years to piece together what happened that summer. The smuggling operation, the connections, the timeline. Everything points to one conclusion. Owen saw something that got him killed." Cally opened the folder with trembling hands. Inside were photocopies of documents, maps with markings, newspaper clippings, and a photograph. Old, faded, but clear enough. It showed a younger Dalton Greer standing next to a truck, and in the truck bed were wooden crates. The date stamp on the photo said August 1990, the month before Owen died. "Where did you get this? declassified files from the investigation that followed. There was a federal task force looking into smuggling routes through these mountains. They shut down the operation in 1991, but by then, he stopped. By then, Owen was already gone. Cally stared at the photograph until her eyes burned. This isn't proof he was murdered. This is just a picture of someone loading trucks. Look at the next page. She turned it over. Another photograph, this one of the creek where Owen had died. There were markers in the frame, evidence flags, and a handwritten note at the bottom, rifle safety engaged, angle of entry inconsistent with accidental discharge. Deputy Allred's initial assessment, suspicious circumstances, overruled by Sheriff Greer, accidental death. Deputy Allred, Gabe's father. Your father knew? Cally's voice came out barely above a whisper. He suspected, but Raymond Greer was the sheriff, and Dad was just a deputy. And after Owen died, after I was declared KIA overseas, my father started drinking. He died of a heart attack 10 years later, and my mother found these files in his things. She never knew what to do with them. She sent them to me once she found out I was alive. Cally looked up at him. This man who'd come back from the dead carrying her brother's truth. Why tell me now? Why not just go to the authorities yourself? Because this is your brother, your family, your right to know. Gabe's voice was gentle but firm. And because I need your help to finish this. The official records are closed. The people involved are either gone or protected. But you grew up here, you know this town. Together maybe we can find the proof we need to reopen the case. Outside, the snow fell heavier now, and Cally felt the weight of 34 years of false grief settling onto her shoulders, alongside the truth she'd been carrying all along without knowing it. 1 week, she said finally. You have 1 week to prove this to me. If you can't, you leave my brother's memory in peace. Gabe nodded slowly. 1 week. That's all I need. 3 days passed, with the snow falling steady, and Gabe Allred sleeping in Cally's guest room, the small space off the kitchen that she'd been using for storage since forever. She'd cleared it out that first night in silence. Not sure why she was doing it, except that sending him to stay with his mother felt wrong somehow. Nessa was still fragile with the shock of having her son back, still trying to reconcile the boy who'd left with the scarred man who'd returned. They kept strange hours, she and Gabe. Both of them were early risers, both comfortable with silence, both carrying the kind of solitude that came from years of living mostly inside your own head. They'd drink coffee before dawn, and Cally would head out to check her traps while Gabe went through his files, making notes, building timelines, constructing the architecture of his investigation. In the evenings, they'd sit at her table and go through Owen's belongings. She'd kept everything, his school papers, his journals, his field notebooks from the hiking and tracking he'd done that last summer. She hadn't looked at these things in years, couldn't bear to. But now she forced herself to read her brother's handwriting, to see the world through his young eyes again. On the 4th morning, she came back from her trapline to find Gabe at the table with several of Owen's notebooks spread out before him, his coffee gone cold beside him. He looked up when she entered, and there was something in his expression that made her stomach tighten. What is it? Owen had a map. Do you remember him having a topographical map that he marked up? Cally thought back, shook her head. He had lots of maps. He was always planning routes, marking where he saw animals. This would have been detailed. Specific markings around the old mining area north of Willow Creek. She went to the shelf where she'd stored the boxes of Owen's things, pulled down the one labeled field gear. Inside were compasses, binoculars, a handheld GPS unit that was ancient by today's standards. And yes, rolled maps held together with rubber bands that had long since deteriorated. She spread them out on the table one by one. Most were standard Forest Service maps with Owen's neat notations, elk sightings, water sources, good camping spots. But the third one made Gabe lean forward sharply. It was a detailed topographical map of the area north of town, the old mining country that had been abandoned since the 30s. Owen had marked several locations with red ink, but one spot, A narrow canyon about 5 miles into the backcountry had been circled over and over, the pen strokes deep enough to tear the paper slightly. "That's it," Gabe said quietly. "That's the location my father mentioned in his notes. The place where Owen said he saw the trucks." Cally traced the circles with her finger, imagining her brother up there in the dark, watching men do something they didn't want witnessed. He must have gone back after he took the photographs, or maybe they knew he'd seen them. Maybe they were looking for him. Gabe's voice was grim. "The creek where he died isn't far from this location. 2 miles, maybe less." The implications settled over the kitchen like cold fog. "If Owen had been targeted, if someone had hunted him down, we should go there," Cally said, surprised by her own certainty, to the place he marked. "If there's any evidence left after all these years, that's where it would be." Gabe studied her face. "It's a hard hike in winter. 5 miles in, 5 miles out, through country that doesn't forgive mistakes. I've been running trap lines in that country since I was 12 years old," she said. "I know every ridge and draw. I can get us there and back in a day if the weather holds." He nodded slowly. "All right. We go tomorrow at first light." That evening Nessa came by, bringing a casserole and worry written plain on her face. She'd aged another decade in the days since Gabe's return, the weight of secrets and grief and impossible relief all pressing down on her at once. Cally watched mother and son together, the careful way they moved around each other, still learning how to be in the same room after so many years apart. "You're planning something," Nessa said, looking between them. "I can see it on both your faces." Gabe didn't lie to her. "We're going up to the mining country, following Owen's map. That's dangerous country in winter. Cal knows it. She'll keep us safe." Nessa turned to Cally then, and her eyes were sharp despite the tears that seemed always ready to fall these days. "You believe him now?" "About Owen?" Cally hesitated, then nodded. "I'm starting to. The evidence is circumstantial, but it's enough to make me wonder. Enough to want to know for sure. And if you find proof?" Nessa's voice dropped to barely a whisper. "What then?" "Then we bring it to the state police," Gabe said. "We reopen the investigation. We get justice for Owen." "Justice." Nessa said the word like it was foreign on her tongue. "My husband carried the weight of what he knew about Owen's death until it killed him. I watched him drink himself into an early grave because he couldn't live with the silence. If justice costs you the same, Mom." Gabe reached across the table, took her hand. "I've spent 20 years in the dark, living under false names, doing things I can't talk about. If I can finally do something clean, something right, something that helps someone." His voice caught. "I need this. I need to make something good out of all those years." Nessa squeezed his hand, then looked at Cally. "You take care of my boy up there. I just got him back. I can't lose him again." "I will," Cally promised and meant it. After Nessa left, Cally and Gabe prepared their gear for the next day's hike. She pulled out her winter pack, checked her first aid kit, laid out extra wool socks and her backup compass. Gabe worked with military precision, every item considered and placed with purpose. "You were telling the truth about being in deep cover?" Cally asked as she sharpened her knife. "All those years? Intelligence work, tracking terrorist financing mostly. Work that required being someone else, somewhere else, with no connection to my old life." He paused in his packing. "I miss so much. My father's funeral, birthdays, holidays, 20 years of my mother's life. All because I was trying to keep her safe from threats that probably would have forgotten about her anyway. You couldn't have known that then." "No, but I know it now. And I know that staying away after the threats were gone, that was cowardice, not protection." He looked at her across the space of the kitchen. "You've been doing something similar, haven't you? Staying up here on this mountain, away from everything?" The observation hit too close. "I like the quiet. So do I. But there's a difference between choosing solitude and hiding from life." He went back to his packing. "We've both been hiding for a long time, Cal. Maybe it's time we stopped." She didn't have an answer to that, so she focused on her gear, testing the bindings on her snowshoes, making sure her emergency supplies were fresh. But his words stayed with her as she worked, uncomfortable and true. That night she lay awake in her bed, listening to the old cabin settle around her. aware of Gabe in the next room in a way that made her feel strange and young and frightened. She hadn't let anyone this close in decades, hadn't allowed herself to care about anything beyond the simple routines of survival. But Owen's face kept appearing in her mind, young and bright and robbed of all his tomorrows. And she realized that Gabe was right. She had been hiding from grief, from connection, from the risk of losing someone again. Tomorrow they would climb into the mountains searching for truth. But tonight, lying in the dark with snow falling soft outside her window, Cally understood that they were both already on a different kind of journey. One that led not just to answers about the past, but to some kind of future neither of them had allowed themselves to imagine. The thought terrified her. It also, for the first time in 34 years, gave her something that felt dangerously like hope. They left before dawn, when the world was still blue dark and the cold had teeth. The temperature had dropped overnight to somewhere around 10 below zero, and their breath froze in their beards, or in Cally's case, on the wool scarf she'd wrapped across her face. The snow had finally stopped, leaving the landscape pristine and treacherous. Every familiar landmark transformed into something new and strange under the white blanket. Cally led, breaking trail on snowshoes, with Gabe following in her tracks. They'd left a note for Nessa and told Holt at the bakery where they were headed. Basic precautions for backcountry winter travel. If they weren't back by dark, someone would know to come looking. The first mile was easy, following the old logging road that curved up through the pine forest. The trees stood silent and heavy with snow, and the only sounds were the crunch of their snowshoes and their breathing, steady and rhythmic. Cally fell into the familiar meditation of mountain walking, her mind quiet, her body doing what it had been trained to do since childhood. But she was aware of Gabe behind her, in a way she hadn't been aware of another person in years. The way he moved, efficient, quiet, reading the terrain with the same instincts she had. He'd been a good tracker even as a young man, and the military had honed those skills to something approaching art. She found herself respecting him, this ghost who'd walked back into her life carrying impossible truths. After the first hour, they stopped to drink water and adjust their layers. The sun was coming up now, painting the peaks pink and gold, and the world felt almost holy in its silence. "You were right about knowing this country," Gabe said, his voice muffled by his scarf. "You moved through it like you're part of it. My father used to say the mountain was our real home." The cabin was just where we slept. She pointed to a ridge ahead. "We'll top that rise and then drop down into the canyon. Another 2 miles from there to the location Owen marked." They climbed. The terrain got steeper, the snow deeper in places where the wind had piled it into drifts. Cally's legs burned with the effort, but it was a good burn, the kind that meant your body was doing what you asked of it. Behind her, Gabe kept pace without complaint, his breathing controlled, despite the altitude and exertion. When they reached the ridgetop, the view opened up before them, valley after valley of pristine wilderness, the old mining country spread out like a map. Somewhere down there 34 years ago, her brother had witnessed something that got him killed. The descent into the canyon was tricky, the slope steep enough that they had to use trees for balance, working their way down in careful stages. Halfway down, Cally stopped abruptly, raising a hand for silence. Gabe froze behind her. She knelt, studying the snow. A line of tracks crossed their path, maybe 6 hours old, already half filled with blown snow, but still visible. Mountain lion, from the size and shape. Big one, probably male, moving through its territory on the hunt. "Cat," she said quietly. "Went through here during the night. We should keep our eyes open." They continued more carefully now, both of them scanning the terrain ahead and above. Mountain lions rarely bothered humans, but they were ambush predators, and winter made all animals more desperate, more willing to take risks they wouldn't normally take. The canyon bottom was narrow, choked with willows and deadfall, a creek running through it that was mostly frozen now, just a trickle of dark water visible beneath the ice. The old mining ruins stood about a quarter-mile up the canyon, collapsed buildings, rusted equipment, the detritus of men who'd come here a century ago chasing dreams of gold and copper. Cally had been here before, years ago, but not since Owen died. Now, looking at it through the lens of Gabe's investigation, she saw it differently. The canyon was isolated, accessible only by this difficult route or by a service road that came in from the north, a road that hadn't been maintained in decades but could still handle a four-wheel drive vehicle if you didn't mind the rough going. Perfect. For people who wanted to move things without being seen. They reached the main mine structure, a wooden building that had partially collapsed but still provided some shelter from the wind. Inside, snow had drifted through the gaps in the roof, and the floor was littered with broken glass, old cans, graffiti from teenagers who'd made the hike over the years. Gabe pulled out Owen's map, oriented himself, then pointed to the northeast corner of the building. According to the notes in my father's file, this is where Owen said he saw them loading trucks. Late at night, using headlights for illumination, they searched the area methodically, Cally taking the perimeter while Gabe focused on the building interior. The snow had covered everything, and anything Owen might have dropped or hidden would be long gone anyway. But Cally wasn't looking for evidence from 34 years ago. She was trying to understand what Owen had seen, what had drawn him back here, what had seemed important enough to photograph and document. Cal, Gabe's voice came from inside the building. Come look at this. She stepped through the sagging doorway. Gabe was kneeling in the corner, brushing snow away from the floorboards. He'd found a loose board and lifted it, revealing a hollow space beneath. Inside the hollow was a waterproof bag, the kind hunters used to keep gear dry. Cally's heart kicked hard against her ribs. Gabe pulled the bag out carefully, laid it on the floor, unsealed it with steady hands despite the cold. Inside was a camera, old, film-based, the kind their father had given Owen for his 16th birthday, and a journal, its pages protected by the waterproof seal. He hid them, Cally whispered. He came back here and hid the evidence. Gabe opened the journal carefully. The pages were yellowed but readable, Owen's familiar handwriting clear and sure. The last entry was dated September 7th, 1990, 2 days before he died. Cally read over Gabe's shoulder, her vision blurring with tears as her brother's voice spoke to her across the decades. Went back to the mine tonight. Saw Dalton Greer and 2 men I didn't recognize. They were loading crates into a truck with out-of-state plates. Heavy crates, handled carefully. Drugs maybe, or guns. He got photographs this time, used the flash, stayed hidden in the tree line. They didn't see me, but I'm worried. Dalton's uncle is the sheriff. If I go to him, will he cover it up? I need to talk to Gabe when he gets back from deployment. He'll know what to do. For now, I'm hiding this here where nobody will find it. Just in case something happens. Just in case I need proof. Just in case something happens. Cally had to turn away, had to press her gloved hands against her eyes to hold back the grief that surged up from someplace she'd kept locked for so long. Owen had known he was in danger. Had known and had tried to be smart about it, and it hadn't mattered. They'd killed him anyway. Hey! Gabe's hand on her shoulder, steady and warm, even through the layers of clothing. We have it now. We have his words. His proof, she nodded, not trusting her voice. Gabe carefully packed the camera and journal back into the waterproof bag. The film in the camera was probably degraded after all this time, but modern forensic techniques might be able to recover something. And the journal itself, with Owen's testimony about what he'd seen, that was evidence. Real evidence. They'd found what they came for. The hike back seemed shorter, even though Cally's legs were tired, and the afternoon sun was already sliding toward the western peaks. They moved quickly, both of them urgent now to get back to town, to figure out the next steps. The mountain lion tracks they'd seen earlier were still visible, and once Cally caught a glimpse of tawny fur in the trees above them, the cat paralleling their route, curious but not threatening. We're being watched, she said quietly. I know. Been tracking us for the last half-mile. Gabe's voice was calm. She's just curious. We're not prey-sized enough to be interesting. They kept moving, giving the cat space, and eventually the tracks veered off toward different hunting grounds. By the time they reached Cally's truck at the trailhead, the sun was setting, and the temperature was dropping again, the cold settling in for what promised to be a bitter night. But Cally barely felt it. She was holding the waterproof bag with Owen's last words, and something inside her that had been frozen solid for 34 years was finally beginning to thaw. They drove straight to Nessa's house, where lamplight glowed warm in the windows and smoke rose from the chimney. She met them at the door, relief flooding her face when she saw them both safe. "You found something," she said, reading it in their expressions before they'd spoken a word. Inside, over coffee and the stew Nessa had kept warm for them, they showed her the journal and the camera. She read Owen's last entry with shaking hands, tears tracking down her weathered cheeks. "All these years," she whispered. "That boy knew he was in danger and tried to be careful, and it wasn't enough." "We have evidence now," Gabe said gently. "Real evidence that can reopen the case." But Nessa looked up at him with something like fear in her eyes. "You don't understand what you're asking to open up again. The people involved, some of them are still here. Still powerful, still dangerous. Raymond Greer retired to Arizona," Cally said. "I remember when he left town. Must have been 95 or 96, but his nephew Dalton is still here," Nessa said. "Lives 2 towns over, runs a construction business, married, respectable. Has his name on the Little League sponsorship board." She paused, her voice dropping. "And my Earl knew. He knew Owen's death wasn't an accident, and they threatened him to keep quiet. Threatened to hurt Gabe if he talked." The room went silent, except for the pop and hiss of the wood stove. Gabe leaned forward, his face carefully controlled. "What exactly did Dad know?" Nessa stood up, moved to a cabinet in the corner, and pulled out a metal lockbox. Her hands trembled as she worked the combination. Inside were papers, photographs, and something that made Cally's blood run cold. A sheriff's badge, old and tarnished, with dark stains that could only be blood. "I found this in Earl's things after he died," Nessa said. "He'd hidden it in the attic along with these documents. I didn't know what to do with them. Didn't know if telling anyone would put my family at more risk." She looked at her son. "You were already gone, declared dead. I had nothing left to protect, but I was a coward. I kept silent." Gabe reached across the table, took his mother's hand. "You weren't a coward. You were trying to survive." Cally was staring at the badge. "That's Raymond Greer's badge?" Nessa nodded. "Earl took it the day Owen died. He was first on scene. Raymond called him there before anyone else arrived. Owen was already gone, but Earl could see right away something was wrong. The rifle's safety was engaged. The angle of the shot was wrong. There were marks in the dirt like there'd been a struggle." She pulled out a folded piece of paper, yellow with age. "Earl wrote this all down that night. Wrote it and sealed it and hid it because Raymond threatened him. Said if Earl talked, if he filed a report that questioned the official ruling, then Gabe would have an accident overseas. That ways would be found to make sure he never came home." Gabe took the paper, unfolded it with careful hands. Cally watched his face as he read his father's words. The pain there, the anger, the grief for a man who'd carried this burden in silence until it destroyed him. "Dad was a good man," Gabe said finally, his voice thick. "He was trying to protect me. But God, what it must have cost him." "It cost him everything," Nessa said quietly. "He started drinking heavy after that. Lost himself in it. I didn't understand why until I found these things. He was trying to drown what he knew, what he couldn't say." Cally reached for the badge, turned it over in her hands. The blood on it was Owen's blood. Evidence linking Raymond Greer directly to the scene of her brother's murder. Along with Owen's journal and the photographs, if they could be developed, they had enough to reopen the investigation. "We need to go to the state police," she said, "not the local sheriff. We need people who aren't connected to the Greer family." "Agreed," Gabe said. "I have a contact in the FBI, someone I worked with during my time in intelligence. He can make sure this gets to the right people, that it's taken seriously." They spent the next hour going through all the evidence, cataloging it, photographing it with Gabe's phone as backup. The journal, the camera, Earl's statement, the badge, all of it laid out like pieces of a puzzle that had finally come together after 34 years. "There's something else you should know," Nessa said as they were preparing to leave. "Dalton Greer married a woman named Jolie Brennan. She worked at the lodge that summer. The summer Owen died, Cally felt something click into place in her memory. Owen mentioned her. Said she was pretty, that he was working up the courage to ask her out. She and Dalton started dating right after Owen's funeral, Nessa said. They were married within a year. I always wondered if there was a connection, if maybe Owen's interest in her had something to do with what happened. Jealousy on top of covering up a smuggling operation, Gabe said grimly. More than enough motive for murder. That night, back at Cally's cabin, neither of them could sleep. They sat at the kitchen table drinking tea, the evidence spread before them. Two people who'd spent decades running from their pasts, finally turning to face them. What happens after we hand this over? Cally asked. After they reopen the investigation? Arrests, probably. Trial. Justice for Owen, finally. Gabe wrapped his hands around his mug. But also the hard part. Watching it all play out, reliving it, having the whole town know what was hidden all this time. I've spent 34 years living with a lie, Cally said. I can handle the truth, however hard it is. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, the cabin creaking around them in the cold, the fire burning low. Finally, Gabe spoke again, his voice quiet. I need to tell you something. About that summer before Owen died. Cally looked up at him. I was interested in you, he said. You were 15, too young, and I knew it. But you were smart and tough, and you moved through these mountains like you were born to them. I thought maybe when you were older, when I got back from deployment, I might... He stopped, shook his head. But then Owen died and I disappeared, and you built a life here without me. Without anyone? I was good at being alone, Cally said. Were you? Or did you just get used to it because it hurt less than caring about people who could be taken away? The words hit too close to truth. She looked down at her hands, scarred and capable, hands that had held weapons and skinned animals and never held another person with tenderness. I don't know how to be any other way, she admitted. Neither do I, Gabe said. But maybe that's something we could learn, together, after this is done. She met his eyes across the table, saw in them the same loneliness she carried, the same years of self-imposed exile. Saw also the possibility of something different. Something that terrified her because it meant opening herself to hurt again. Maybe, she said, and the word hung in the air between them, like a promise neither of them was quite ready to make, but couldn't help offering anyway. Outside, the night was clear and cold, stars burning bright in the black sky. Somewhere out there, the people who'd killed her brother were living their lives, thinking they'd gotten away with it. But tomorrow they would start the process of bringing the truth to light, for Owen, for Earl, for all the years of silence and grief and lies, for the chance, however slim, at something like peace. Morning came grey and heavy with the promise of more snow. Cally woke to find Gabe already up, talking quietly on his phone in the kitchen. She could hear the careful professional tone in his voice, the one that meant he was speaking to his FBI contact. Setting things in motion, she made coffee, fed the fire, tried to settle the nervousness in her stomach. Today, they would go to Nessa's, collect all the evidence and drive to the state capital to meet with Gabe's contact. Today, the machinery of justice would finally start grinding through the decades of lies. But when Gabe hung up the phone, his face was troubled. What's wrong? My contact wants us to hold off a day. There's some jurisdictional question about the case, since it happened so long ago. Since the local sheriff at the time is implicated, they need to figure out who has authority to investigate. He set his phone down heavily. Red tape. Even after 34 years, there's still red tape. Cally felt a flash of anger. So we just wait? While Dalton Greer lives his nice, comfortable life? One day, that's all. They'll have it sorted out by tomorrow. Gabe rubbed his face, looking suddenly exhausted. In the meantime, we keep the evidence secure. We don't talk to anyone about what we found, and we wait. She hated waiting, hated the feeling that Owen's truth was still being held back, still being processed through systems that hadn't cared enough to find it the first time. But she nodded, swallowing her frustration. They drove to Nessa's to tell her about the delay. She met them at the door looking older than she had the night before, as if the weight of what she knew had aged her overnight. Come in, she said. I need to talk to you both. Something in her voice made Cally's skin prickle. They followed her into the kitchen, where she had coffee waiting and her hands shaking so badly she could barely pour it. "Mom, what's wrong?" Gabe asked. Nessa sat down heavily, looked at both of them with eyes full of tears and shame. "I need to tell you something I should have told you last night. Something I've been carrying for 10 years, since Earl died." The room seemed to contract around them. Cally felt her heart start to pound. "I knew," Nessa said, the words coming out broken. "I knew about Owen's death. Not everything, but enough. I knew it wasn't an accident." The words fell like stones. Gabe went very still. "What do you mean you knew?" "Earl came home that night, the night Owen died. He was shaking, pale, looked like he'd seen something terrible. He told me he'd been called to the creek, that Owen Dray had been found dead. He said it looked wrong, that the evidence didn't match what Raymond was calling it. But Raymond had threatened him, had said if Earl filed a report questioning the accident ruling, then—" Her voice broke. "Then you would have an accident overseas. That Raymond had connections, that he could make sure you never came home." Cally couldn't breathe, couldn't process what she was hearing. "Earl was torn apart," Nessa continued. "He wanted to do the right thing, wanted to get justice for that boy. But you were his son, and I—" Tears streamed down her face now. "I told him to stay silent. I told him that keeping you safe mattered more than justice for a dead boy. That we'd already lost so much we couldn't lose you too." "Mom, no, let me finish. Earl lived with that choice. It destroyed him slowly, turned him into someone I barely recognized. The drinking, the nightmares, the way he'd go days without speaking. He was dying inside from what he knew, what he'd covered up. And when he finally did die, when I found all those documents and photographs and that badge—" She looked at Cally now, her eyes pleading. "I knew then what my choice had cost. Knew that your brother died, and my silence had let his murderers walk free. And I still did nothing. Because Earl was gone, and Gabe was gone, and I was alone, and I was so afraid." The kitchen was silent, except for the sound of Nessa's ragged breathing. Cally sat frozen, trying to understand what she was hearing. This woman she'd bought bread for out of kindness, had known about Owen's murder for a decade, and said nothing. "You knew," Cally said finally, her voice coming out flat and dead. "You knew my brother was murdered and you kept quiet." "Yes." Nessa didn't try to defend herself. "I was a coward. I was afraid. And I told myself that the knowledge I carried was punishment enough, that I didn't need to add to it by coming forward. But it was just more cowardice, more fear." Gabe stood up abruptly, walked to the window, his back rigid. Cally could see him processing this, trying to reconcile the mother he'd known with this admission of complicity. "Why tell us now?" Gabe asked without turning around. "Because you're taking this to the authorities tomorrow. Because they'll investigate, and they'll find Earl's documents, and they'll see the dates. They'll know when Earl wrote his statement, when he took that badge. And they'll wonder why nothing was done. And I can't—" Her voice cracked. "I can't let you walk into that without knowing the full truth. Without understanding that your father wasn't just a witness. He was complicit in the cover-up. And so was I." She pulled out another document from the lockbox, this one in her own handwriting, dated and notarized. "I wrote this 3 days ago after you came back. My full confession of what I knew and when I knew it. If there are legal consequences for staying silent, I'll face them. I should have faced them years ago." Cally took the paper with numb hands, read Nessa's careful accounting of her husband's confession, of her own choice to tell him to stay quiet, of the years of silence that followed. It was all there, dated and signed, an old woman's reckoning with her own cowardice. "I don't expect forgiveness," Nessa said. "Not from you, Cally, and maybe not from you either, Gabriel. But I need you to know that I'm done with silence. I'm done with lies. Whatever happens when you take this evidence forward, I'll tell them everything. I'll face whatever consequences come." Gabe turned from the window. His face was pale but composed. "You were trying to protect me. That's no excuse for letting a murderer go free." "No," he agreed. "It's not." He looked at Cally and she saw in his eyes a question. Could she forgive this? Could she understand the impossible choice Nessa and Earl had faced? Their son's life weighed against justice for another family's son. She didn't know. She stood up, walked to the window, looked out at the snow-covered street, thought about her brother, 19 years old and full of dreams, dying in a creek while people who could have helped him chose to stay silent. Thought about Earl Allred, drinking himself to death under the weight of that silence. Thought about Nessa, living alone with her guilt and fear. "I need some air," she said, and walked out before anyone could stop her. Outside, the cold bit through her coat, but she welcomed it. Needed something sharp and real to cut through the fog of betrayal and confusion. She walked without direction, her feet carrying her through the familiar streets of Pine Haven while her mind reeled. Nessa had known. For 10 years, she'd known Owen was murdered, and she'd said nothing. And before that, Earl had known and been threatened into silence. And Raymond Greer had used that fear, had weaponized a father's love for his son to get away with murder. She ended up at the cemetery, standing in front of Owen's grave, without consciously deciding to go there. The stone was simple, his name, his dates, and the words, beloved son and brother, no mention of how he died. No acknowledgement of the truth. She heard footsteps behind her, turned to find Gabe approaching carefully. "I'm not going to ask if you're okay," he said. "Because you're not." Your mother knew. The words came out harsh. She knew, and she chose to protect you instead of getting justice for Owen. "I know. And you're just, what? Okay with that?" "I'm not okay with it," Gabe said. "I'm angry and hurt and trying to understand how my parents, people I thought I knew, could make that choice. But I also understand that they were terrified. That Raymond Greer had power and connections and no conscience about using them." He paused. "My father died of that secret. It killed him just as surely as if he'd been shot. And my mother has been living in hell for 10 years. They paid for their silence, Cal. Maybe not in the way justice demands, but they paid. And what about Owen?" Cally's voice broke. "What about what he paid?" "That's why we're doing this. That's why we're taking all the evidence, including my mother's confession, to the authorities. So Owen finally gets justice. So the people who actually killed him, Raymond and Dalton Greer, face consequences." He came to stand beside her, both of them looking at Owen's grave. "My parents made a terrible choice, but they're not the ones who pulled the trigger. They're not the ones who staged a murder to look like an accident." Cally knew he was right, knew that her anger at Nessa, while justified, was misdirected. The real villains were the Greers, the sheriff who'd killed a boy to cover up a smuggling operation, and the nephew who'd helped him do it, but knowing it didn't make the betrayal hurt less. "I need time," she said, "to process this. Figure out how I feel about your mother's confession." "I understand." Gabe's hand found hers, squeezed gently. "Take all the time you need. But tomorrow we still go forward with taking this to the FBI. Tomorrow we still get justice for Owen. Whatever else happens, that doesn't change." She nodded, gripping his hand back. And standing there in the snow beside her brother's grave, Cally understood that justice was rarely simple, that the truth was messier than she'd imagined, and that sometimes the people you needed to forgive were the ones who'd been hurt almost as badly as you had. They spent the rest of that day preparing. Gabe made copies of everything, photographing documents, scanning pages, creating backups that he sent to secure servers only he could access. Years of intelligence work had taught him to never trust that evidence would survive in a single location. Cally watched him work with quiet efficiency, organizing everything into a briefcase that would go with them tomorrow to the capital. She'd gone back to Nessa's house late in the afternoon. Not because she'd forgiven her, she wasn't sure she could, or even if forgiveness was what was needed, but because Nessa's confession, as painful as it was, had been an act of courage. The old woman was choosing truth over safety finally, even though it would cost her whatever reputation she had left in this town. "I don't know what to say to you," Cally had told her, standing in the doorway of Nessa's kitchen. "I'm angry and hurt, and I understand it at the same time, and I don't know how to hold all of that together." "You don't have to say anything," Nessa replied. Her face was composed but exhausted, like someone who'd finally set down a weight they'd been carrying too long. "I'm not asking for forgiveness. I'm just trying to do what's right now, even though it's 34 years too late. Your confession, it could get you in legal trouble." "I know, and I'm prepared for that." Nessa looked out her window at the snow-covered street. "I've been dead inside for 10 years anyway. At least this way I'll be free." That evening, as Cally and Gabe sat in her cabin, going over the timeline one more time, Holt Tremaine showed up at the door. He carried a paper bag that smelled of fresh bread, and his expression was troubled. "Heard you two have been asking questions about Owen Dray's death," he said without preamble. "Heard some other things, too, through the grapevine." Cally tensed. Small towns were terrible at keeping secrets. "What have you heard?" "That Gabe came back from the dead. That Nessa's been crying more than usual. That you and Gabe have been up in the old mining country." Holt set the bag on the table, fresh rolls, still warm, and looked at them both seriously. "I was here when Owen died. I remember that summer. What do you remember?" Gabe asked. Holt sat down heavily, his old hands flat on the table. "I remember that Owen was excited about something. Kept coming into the bakery, buying bread for that girl Jolie who worked at the lodge. He'd blush when I asked about her, get all tongue-tied. He had it bad." He paused. "And I remember Dalton Greer coming in one day asking if I'd seen Owen around. There was something in the way he asked, not friendly. More like he was hunting." "Did you tell anyone this at the time?" Cally asked. "Told the sheriff." "Raymond Greer." Holt's mouth twisted. "He thanked me for the information and said boys were always getting territorial over girls, nothing to worry about. Then Owen died, and Raymond said it was an accident, and everyone moved on." He looked at Cally. "Except I never quite believed it. Owen was too careful with weapons. His father taught him right. And the timing felt wrong, him dying just when Dalton was asking about him. Why didn't you say something?" The question came out harsher than Cally intended. To who? The sheriff was Dalton's uncle. The deputy was scared of his own shadow after Owen died. "And I was just a baker without proof of anything except a bad feeling." Holt met her eyes. "I failed your brother. I've carried that for 34 years. So if you're finally getting justice for him, if that's what all this is about, then I want to help. I'll testify to what I saw, what I knew. I'll do whatever you need." Gabe pulled out a notepad. "Tell me everything you remember. Every detail, every conversation, every strange thing you noticed that summer." Holt talked for an hour, his memory surprisingly sharp for events that had happened decades ago. He remembered seeing Dalton and 2 other men in a truck with out-of-state plates, stopping at the bakery late one night for coffee. He remembered that one of the men had a tattoo, a snake coiled around a knife, on his forearm. He remembered that Dalton had seemed nervous, jumpy, not like his usual cocky self. "There's something else," Holt said as he was preparing to leave. "Jolie, the girl Owen liked. She married Dalton not 6 months after Owen died. Always seemed fast to me. Like maybe Dalton was making sure she was tied to him, couldn't talk, even if she wanted to." After Holt left, Cally and Gabe sat in silence for a long time. The pieces were coming together, forming a picture of that summer that was so much darker than anyone had acknowledged. A smuggling operation, a rivalry over a girl, a boy who'd seen too much, and a murder disguised as an accident, covered up by people with power and no conscience. "We should confront them," Cally said suddenly. "Before we go to the FBI, we should go to Dalton Greer and make him look us in the eye. That could be dangerous. I don't care." She stood up, restless energy flooding through her. "I want him to know that we know. I want him to see Owen's journal, to understand that my brother documented what he saw. I want him to feel what it's like when the past comes back to swallow you whole." Gabe studied her face. "This isn't about evidence anymore, is it? This is about making him face what he did." Yes, she didn't try to deny it. Owen was 19 years old. He had his whole life ahead of him. And Dalton Greer has been living free all this time, probably never thinking about the boy he helped murder. I want that to end. I want him to know that Owen mattered, that he's not forgotten." "All right," Gabe said. "We'll go tomorrow morning, before we meet with my FBI contact. We'll give Dalton Greer one chance to confess, to do the right thing. And if he doesn't," he touched the briefcase full of evidence, "then we bury him in court." That night Cally barely slept. She lay awake, thinking about Owen, about that last summer when he'd been so alive, so full of hope. She thought about Jolie, the girl he'd liked, but never gotten the courage to ask out. She thought about Dalton Greer, living a comfortable life built on her brother's death, and she thought about tomorrow, about finally looking into the face of the man who'd helped kill Owen and demanding answers. Beside her, in the next room, she could hear Gabe moving around. He wasn't sleeping either. They were both waiting for dawn, for the moment when they would finally seek the confrontation that was 34 years overdue. The clock on her nightstand showed 3 in the morning when her phone buzzed with a text. It was from Gabe, even though he was only 20 feet away. "You awake?" "Yes," she typed back, scared. She thought about lying, about maintaining the walls she'd built so carefully. But they'd been through too much for dishonesty now. Terrified. Me too. But we're doing the right thing. I know. A pause, and then, after this is over, after Owen gets justice, I'd like to take you to dinner. Somewhere nice. Somewhere that isn't this mountain. Cally stared at her phone, her heart doing something complicated in her chest. He was offering her a future. A possibility beyond the solitude she'd wrapped around herself like armor. "I'd like that," she typed, and hit send before she could second-guess herself. The rest of the night passed in restless waiting. When dawn finally came, grey and cold, Cally rose and dressed with care. She put on clean jeans, a good sweater, her father's coat. She strapped on the hunting knife that had been his, the one she wore on her traplines. Not because she expected violence, but because she needed to feel connected to her family, to her father and her brother and the mountain itself. Gabe was already up, drinking coffee, wearing dark jeans and a button-down shirt under his jacket. He looked like what he was, a man with military training and intelligence experience, someone not to be taken lightly. "Ready?" he asked. "No, but let's go anyway." They picked up Nessa on the way. She'd insisted on coming, saying that she'd been silent too long, that she needed to face this too. She sat in the back seat of Cally's truck, quiet and composed, her hands folded around a purse that Cally suspected contained her written confession. The drive to the next town took 40 minutes, through country that was beautiful and harsh under the winter sun. Dalton Greer's construction company sat on the edge of the commercial district, a modern building with a parking lot full of trucks. Everything neat and prosperous and successful. They sat in the truck for a moment, all 3 of them, gathering courage for what came next. "Last chance to turn back," Gabe said. "We could just go straight to the FBI, let them handle everything." But Cally was already opening her door. "No, I need to do this. Owen deserves this." The receptionist looked up in surprise when 3 strangers walked in, all of them carrying the weight of purpose. "Can I help you?" "We're here to see Dalton Greer," Gabe said. "Tell him it's about Owen Dray." The receptionist's smile faltered. "I'm not sure Mr. Greer is available. He'll want to see us," Cally said. And there was something in her voice that made the young woman reach for her phone without further argument. 2 minutes later, they were being led down a hallway to a corner office. And there, sitting behind a large desk with windows overlooking the mountains, was Dalton Greer. He was in his 50s now, thick around the middle, his hair receding, his face showing the comfortable wear of a man who'd lived well. He looked up as they entered, and Cally saw the recognition flicker across his face, followed by something that might have been fear. "I know you," he said, looking at Cally. "You're Owen Dray's sister." "I am." She walked forward, set the briefcase on his desk. "And we need to talk about how my brother really died." Behind her, Gabe closed the office door with a quiet click that sounded like a cell door locking shut. Dalton Greer's face had gone pale. He glanced at the door where Gabe stood, then at Nessa, then back to Cally. "I don't know what you think you know. We know everything." Cally opened the briefcase, pulled out Owen's journal. "We found this hidden in the old mine. My brother documented what he saw that summer. The smuggling operation, the trucks. You and your uncle loading crates." She laid the journal open to Owen's last entry, turned it so Dalton could read his own name in her brother's handwriting. She watched the color drain further from his face, watched his hands begin to shake. "We also have this." Gabe stepped forward, placing the sheriff's badge on the desk. Your Uncle Raymond's badge, with my father's statement about finding it at the scene of Owen's death. With Owen's blood on it. And we have this. Nessa's voice was quiet but steady. She set her own confession on the desk. My testimony about what my husband knew, about how Raymond threatened him into silence. Dalton stared at the evidence laid out before him like an indictment. His breathing had gone shallow, his face slick with sudden sweat. This was 34 years ago. You can't prove anything after all this time. The journal proves Owen witnessed your smuggling operation, Cally said. The badge proves Raymond was at the scene. My brother's notes prove he planned to go to the authorities. And your uncle's subsequent actions, leaving town, retiring to Arizona right after the federal task force shut down the smuggling routes, that proves consciousness of guilt. I want a lawyer. You're going to need one. Gabe pulled out his phone, showed Dalton the screen. That's my FBI contact. He's waiting for our call. We have two options here. Option 1, you tell us the truth right now. Give us a full confession, and we'll let the authorities know you cooperated. Option 2, we walk out of here, hand everything over to the FBI, and let them dig into every aspect of your life until they find enough to bury you. Dalton's eyes darted between them, calculating, desperate. You're recording this? No, Gabe said. No recordings, no tricks. Just 3 people who want the truth about a boy who died too young. The office was silent, except for the hum of the heating system and Dalton's ragged breathing. Cally watched him, this man who'd lived free while her brother lay cold in the ground, and she felt a strange calmness settle over her. Whatever he said or didn't say, they had enough. Owen would get justice. It wasn't supposed to happen, Dalton said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. It was never supposed to. He stopped, ran his hands through his thinning hair. We were just moving goods through the mountains. Drugs, mostly. Small operation. My uncle provided protection, made sure the routes stayed clear. It was easy money and nobody was getting hurt. Until my brother saw you, Cally said. Dalton nodded miserably. He was up there photographing owls or something. Must have heard the trucks come to investigate. He got photos. We didn't know at first, but then he swallowed hard. He'd been talking to Jolie. She was working at the lodge. And Owen, he was just a kid trying to impress her. He mentioned to her that he'd seen something weird up in the mining country, said he had photos that might be important. And Jolie told you, Gabe said. She didn't know what it meant. She just thought it was funny, this kid trying to act like he was doing something important. But I knew what he'd seen, and I panicked. I went to my Uncle Raymond. Cally's hands clenched into fists. And Raymond decided to kill him. I didn't want that. You have to believe me. I just wanted to scare him, get the photos back, make sure he kept quiet. But Raymond, Dalton's voice cracked. Raymond said there was too much at stake. Said if Owen talked, the whole operation would come down. We'd all go to prison. He said we had to take care of it. Take care of it, Cally repeated, the euphemism bitter on her tongue. My brother was 19 years old. He had dreams, plans, people who loved him. And you took care of it. Raymond made me go with him. Said I needed to be part of it. That way I couldn't talk without incriminating myself. We found Owen at the creek that morning. Raymond tried to take the camera from him. Owen fought back. They struggled. And then Dalton pressed his hands against his eyes. Then Raymond grabbed Owen's rifle and shot him. Just like that. One shot and Owen went down in the water. The room seemed to tilt. Hearing the words, the actual description of her brother's murder was different from knowing it had happened. Cally felt Gabe's hand on her shoulder, steadying her. We made it look like an accident, Dalton continued, the words tumbling out now like he couldn't stop them. Put the rifle in Owen's hands, made sure the scene looked right. Raymond called his deputy, Earl Allred, made him sign off on it as an accident. Threatened him to keep him quiet. He looked up at Nessa with haunted eyes. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry your husband was put in that position. Don't apologize to me, Nessa said coldly. Apologize to her, Dalton turned to Cally. I'm sorry. I've been sorry every day for 34 years. I see Owen's face in my dreams. I hear the sound of that gunshot. I've never stopped. Stop, Cally said. The word came out hard. Don't tell me about your guilt. Don't tell me about your nightmares. You've had 34 years of life that my brother never got. You don't deserve my sympathy." Dalton nodded, tears streaming down his face now.
"What happens now?"
"Now you write down everything you just told us," Gabe said. "Every detail. Who was involved, what happened, where the evidence is, everything. And then," Dalton's voice shook, "then we call the FBI. Then you face the consequences you should have faced 34 years ago." Dalton nodded slowly, reaching for a legal pad on his desk. His hands trembled as he began to write, the pen scratching across paper in the quiet office. Cally watched him, this man who'd helped murder her brother and felt no satisfaction in his breaking. Just a hollow ache where justice should have brought relief. It took him 20 minutes to write it all down. The smuggling operation, the players involved, the night Owen confronted them, the murder itself, the cover-up. He signed and dated it, his signature shaky but legible. Gabe read it over, then carefully photographed each page with his phone. "We're going to need to talk about your uncle. Where is Raymond now?" "Still in Arizona, retired, living off his pension like he's earned it." Bitterness crept into Dalton's voice. "After Owen died, after the feds shut down the smuggling routes a year later, he got out clean. Made me swear I'd never talk. Said if I did, he'd make sure I went down alone. I've been paying him to keep quiet for 34 years. Paying him?
Hush money.
$500 a month, every month, transferred to an account in his name. He said it was the cost of doing business, of making sure the past stayed buried." Gabe and Cally exchanged glances. "That's documented." "You have records of these payments?" Dalton nodded. "In my personal files. I can get them for you." "Do it." While Dalton accessed his computer files, pulling up years of bank transfers to Raymond Greer, Cally walked to the window and looked out at the mountains. Snow covered everything, pristine and beautiful and indifferent to human suffering. Owen had loved these mountains, had wanted to spend his life protecting the wildlife here, studying the delicate balance of ecosystems. Instead, he died in them, killed for seeing something he shouldn't have. "I need to ask you something," she said without turning around. "Did Owen suffer?" The office went silent. Finally, Dalton spoke, his voice thick. "No, it was fast. Raymond was a good shot. Owen didn't. He wouldn't have felt much. Small mercy. The only one Owen had been granted. And Jolie?" Cally turned to face him.
"Does she know?"
"No." Dalton's face crumpled. "I married her to keep her close, to make sure she never put the pieces together about what she'd told me. But I never told her what happened. She thinks Owen's death was an accident. She has nightmares sometimes about him, about whether we could have been friends if he'd lived." "You stole that from her too," Nessa said. "You stole her chance to know the truth, to grieve honestly." "I know." Dalton printed out the bank records, added them to his confession. "I've stolen a lot of things. A lot of lives. I don't expect forgiveness." "Good," Cally said. "Because you won't get it." Gabe made the call then, stepping into the hallway to talk to his FBI contact. Cally could hear his voice, calm and professional, laying out the evidence, the confession, the location. Within minutes he was back. "They're sending agents now. Should be here within the hour. They want us to stay, to give our statements." Dalton sat behind his desk, looking smaller somehow, diminished. "What about my wife, my kids?" "They don't know anything about this." "That's not our concern," Gabe said. "You should have thought about them 34 years ago before you helped cover up a murder." They waited in heavy silence. At one point, Dalton's secretary knocked, asking if everything was all right. Gabe told her Mr. Greer was in an important meeting, not to be disturbed. She left, confused but obedient. When the FBI agents arrived, they were efficient and professional. They took Dalton's confession, the physical evidence, statements from Cally, Gabe, and Nessa. They arrested Dalton on the spot, reading him his rights in the same office where he'd confessed. As they led him out in handcuffs, he looked back at Cally. "I really am sorry, for whatever that's worth." "It's worth nothing," she said. "But at least now you'll pay for what you did." The office emptied quickly after that. The agents assured them they'd be contacting Raymond Greer in Arizona, that with Dalton's confession and the physical evidence, they had more than enough for charges. They thanked Cally for never giving up on her brother. thanked Gabe for his careful investigation, thanked Nessa for her courage in coming forward. But as they walked out into the cold afternoon air, Cally felt nothing like triumph. Just exhaustion and grief and a strange sense of anticlimax. 34 years of wondering, and now she knew. 34 years of false peace, and now there would be trials and testimony, and the whole town knowing what had been hidden. "You okay?" Gabe asked, his arm around her shoulders as they walked to the truck. "I don't know," she said honestly. "Ask me in a year. Ask me after the trials, after everything is finally over." "I will," he said. "I'll be here to ask," and somehow, despite everything, that promise was enough to keep her standing. 6 months passed before the trials were done. 6 months of testimony and evidence, and the whole town of Pinehaven discovering that the young man who died in their midst 34 years ago had been murdered. 6 months of Cally learning to live with the truth she'd fought so hard to find. Raymond Greer was convicted of first-degree murder and conspiracy. At 76 years old, he'd die in prison, and there was a certain justice in that, him losing his comfortable retirement, his freedom, everything he'd tried so hard to protect. Dalton received 20 years with the possibility of parole, his cooperation and genuine remorse earning him some mercy from the court. But the real sentence, Cally thought, was the one he'd carry in his heart. His wife had left him, taking their children. His business was gone, his reputation destroyed. He'd spend the rest of his life knowing he'd helped murder a boy for nothing more than fear and greed. Jolie came to see Cally one afternoon in early summer, when the mountains were green and alive again, and the memory of that cold winter felt distant. She was a small woman with grey threading through her dark hair and eyes that carried old sorrow. "I didn't know," she said, sitting at Cally's kitchen table where so much of this had unfolded. "I swear to you, I didn't know what telling Dalton about Owen's photos would lead to." "I know." And Cally did. Jolie was a victim too, married to a man who'd used her innocence as cover for his guilt. "He talked about you," Jolie said. "Owen, that summer. He'd come by the lodge and we'd talk. He was sweet, nervous. He wanted to ask me out but kept chickening out." Tears slid down her cheeks. "I wish he had. I wish I'd known him better. Maybe things would have been different. Maybe," Cally said gently. "Or maybe Owen would have died anyway, and you'd carry even more grief." "You can't know." "None of us can." After Jolie left, Cally walked up to the cemetery where a new headstone had been placed beside Owen's original marker. This one told the truth. Owen Marcus Dray, beloved son and brother. Murdered September 9th, 1990. Justice delayed but not denied. She knelt beside it, touched the carved letters of his name. "You were right to try to do the right thing," she told him. "You were brave and good, and you deserved so much better than what happened. But at least now people know the truth. At least now they remember you as you were. Someone who stood up for what was right even when it was dangerous." The wind moved through the pines above her, carrying the scent of summer, and Cally let herself believe that somewhere, somehow, her brother was at peace. She found Nessa at the bakery that evening, sitting with Holt over coffee and conversation. The old woman looked lighter somehow, the weight of her secret finally lifted. She'd received no legal punishment for her silence. The statute of limitations had long passed, and her cooperation in the investigation had been valuable. But she'd been judged by the town, whispered about, avoided by some who thought she should have spoken sooner. She handled it with quiet dignity, much as she'd handled everything else. "Join us," Holt said when he saw Cally. And she slid into the booth beside them. They talked about small things, the weather, the tourist season starting up, Holt's plan to finally retire and hand the bakery over to his niece. Normal conversation between people who'd been through something terrible together and survived it. "Gabriel's looking for you," Nessa said as they were leaving. "Said to tell you he'd be at your place around 7. Cally's heart did that complicated thing it had been doing lately whenever Gabe's name came up. They'd been seeing each other properly now for 3 months, taking things slow, learning each other without the weight of investigation and grief pressing down on them. He'd bought a small house in town, was working as a wilderness guide for tourists, was slowly building a life here that didn't require hiding or running. He was waiting on her porch when she got home, holding a bag from Holt's Bakery and wearing a smile that made him look younger. "Brought dinner," he said. "Fresh bread, cheese, some of that smoked salmon from the store." They ate on her porch as the sun set over the mountains, painting the peaks in shades of gold and pink. The same mountains where Owen had died, where Cally had spent decades running trap lines alone, where both she and Gabe had learned to survive by keeping the world at arm's length. "I've been thinking," Gabe said, as they watched the light fade, "about what comes next, about whether I want to keep doing the guide work or try something else. What would you want to do?" "Teach, maybe, at the community college. Share some of what I learned about wilderness survival, tracking, that kind of thing." He paused. "I'd like to teach it the way Owen would have, with respect for the land, understanding that we're just visitors here." Cally reached for his hand, laced her fingers through his. He would have liked that. They sat in comfortable silence as the stars began to appear overhead, countless points of light in the darkening sky. Cally thought about her brother, about Earl Allred, about all the years of silence and grief. Thought about justice and truth and how they weren't quite the same thing, but were both necessary. "Thank you," she said finally. "For what?" "For coming back. For caring enough about Owen to spend years piecing together the truth. For giving me the closure I didn't even know I needed." Gabe squeezed her hand. "We gave each other that. Both of us stuck in the past, both of us afraid to move forward. It took Owen's truth to free us both." She leaned against him, feeling the solid warmth of him, the steady rhythm of his breathing. For 34 years, she'd been alone on this mountain, convinced that solitude was safety, that distance was protection. But Gabe had walked back into her life carrying impossible truths, and in uncovering them together, they'd found something neither of them had been looking for. They'd found each other, below them. The lights of Pinehaven twinkled in the gathering dark. The bakery where this had all started would be closing soon, Holt turning off the ovens, locking up for the night. Nessa would be in her too-big house, no longer haunted by secrets she couldn't tell. And somewhere in Arizona, Raymond Greer sat in a prison cell, finally paying for the life he'd stolen. But here, on this porch, under these stars, Cally felt something she hadn't felt in decades. She felt hope. She felt possibility. She felt like maybe finally she could stop running from her grief and start living through it. "Stay," she said to Gabe, the word both question and invitation. "Tonight. Tonight, tomorrow, however long you want." He turned to face her, his eyes reflecting starlight. "What if I want forever?" "Then stay forever," she said, and kissed him as the mountains settled into night around them. Ancient and patient, and finally, after so many years, bearing witness to something good. Sometimes the smallest kindness can unlock the biggest truth. Cally had bought bread for a stranger, and that simple act had set in motion everything that followed. Justice for Owen, peace for Nessa and Earl's memory, a future for herself and Gabe that neither of them had dared imagine. It hadn't been quick. It hadn't been easy, but it had been worth it. Every step of the way, it had been worth it.